Good morning, everybody. Joining me today is Ali, one of our cybersecurity analysts, and I'm Charles. I'm one of our Middle East North Africa security analysts, and we're going to be talking about recent cyber developments in the Middle East and North Africa region. Specifically, I believe we were going to talk about Jordan. They recently passed a bill that bans the use of virtual private networking. From my angle, I'll just say real quick, it's part of a trend of both digital um, and non-digital and analog repression across Middle East and North Africa that we've seen. And so maybe Ali, you could talk about the specifics of the VPN, maybe some of the other aspects of the bill that are of interest from the cyber perspective.
Yeah, definitely. I'd be happy to, Charlie. And to your point, I was planning to touch on some of the other countries that we've seen kind of take this approach of using cybercrime legislation as a means by which to presumably help combat cybercrime, but also with the dual focus of engaging in certain repressive controls over citizens' ability to dissent or other free speech initiatives. And so in the case of this Jordan bill, one aspect of it is the use of VPN or proxies, which I'll get to in a moment. But more broadly speaking, the bill bans a number of activities on social media platforms. It prohibits the dispersion of fake news, the promotion or instigation of inciting immorality, rather. It also pertains to online assassination of personalities, provoking strife, undermining national unity, or demonstrating contempt for religions. And so a number of pushbacks you've already seen from the United States, from the European Union, from groups like the Human Rights Watch is, first of all, just the broad, vague nature of this language and what it is prohibiting by domestic citizens. And to your point, again, it also prevents any fictitious obfuscation of a person's IP address, which has to do with either virtual private networks, proxies, Tor browsers. And again, to some degree, these tools can be used by malicious cyber actors as a way to conduct cybercrime initiatives while creating a degree of separation between their activities and the person behind them. However, especially in these Middle Eastern countries, you see a number of citizens using virtual private networks for their safety, whether it's because of their identity in a minority group that maybe is not welcomed in some of these Middle Eastern countries, for instance, queer LGBTQ communities, as well as journalists, political dissidents, and even just everyday citizens that still want to have some degree of freedom of speech in their online activity. And Jordan's bill right now is getting a lot of coverage, but it's important to note that we've seen a number of countries in the Middle East over the last few years pass similar bills. We've seen this in Syria and Iraq. Syria's legislation is actually quite similar, where it prevents slander, defamation, online harassment, and also these crimes against decency, modesty, or anything against the state, which of course is very different from the way that cybercrime bills are written in the West. And this really is cutting into citizens' freedom of expression. In Iraq, it was very similar, with extensive prison sentences for anything that could be found as threatening the independence, unity, safety, or the security interests of the state. And again, this is, I think, a tool by some of these more authoritarian governments to act under the guise of just trying to bolster cybersecurity initiatives, but really, I think, addressing the fact that in today's geopolitical landscape, social media platforms can be a really potent tool for citizens moving against governments. And I'm sure in the Middle East, of course, this is more fresh on people's minds, especially given the Arab Revolution that occurred almost a decade ago now. And I think that that's still really fresh on a lot of these governments' minds. And something else I was hoping to talk more about today in conjunction with this sort of these state control initiatives are, of course, the Middle East is one of the top producers of technologies like spyware, surveillance technology, particularly Israel, of course. The United States recently just banned the NSO Group and another Israeli firm, Candaroo, both of which are, of course, responsible for the production and dissemination of very sophisticated spyware tools, including zero-click technology, which doesn't need any kind of user interaction in order to initiate the spyware on their phone. And we've also seen in a lot of these Middle Eastern countries huge either deals or purchasing activities of these technologies for domestic use cases, which again gets into how these governments both use legislation and economic tools in an effort to stymie any kind of protest.
Yeah, to break in here a little bit, I want to say that this focus on cybercrime, or this use of cybercrime as a way to crack down on dissent, is kind of an extension of an earlier trend we saw in the mid 2010s of using counterterrorism legislation to really go after dissent in a lot of ways. Have very vaguely worded, in MENA in particular, have very vaguely worded counterterrorism statutes or laws that could essentially apply to a variety of conduct, not just violent extremism. So
Right.
I will say the cybercrime trend is certainly in keeping with what we've seen as far as repression in the region. It's also in keeping with the trends of physical repression that we've seen in the region. Just yesterday, I wrote a piece on Lebanon where an LGBTQ hangout was attacked by a right-wing militia group. And a lot of countries in the region have very vaguely worded laws that don't explicitly outlaw homosexuality per se or LGBTQ conduct, but they'll frame it as, inciting immorality or unnatural sexual relations or something that's really, really broad, that it's not saying being gay is illegal. It's saying that, it's having these broadly worded laws that anybody can run afoul of, including, unfortunately, travelers and business people as they go about their travels abroad.
Absolutely, and we've written a few times, Haley and I, the other cyber analyst, on examples of when there were malicious cyber campaigns targeting specific minority groups in the region. I think another important cyber-related trend that maybe hasn't been quite as pronounced in the last few months, but is definitely a really heavy focus in this region as well, is hacktivism. I actually discussed this last week with Carmen when we were talking about Latin America, and of course it probably gets the most coverage in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war, but the Middle East is certainly also an area where we see politically and religiously motivated hacktivist activities go on, particularly in the context of Israeli-Iranian tensions. Over the last few years, we've seen quite a few different groups emerge, some of them with purported ties to governments. But in the case of Israel and Iran, I think that this is a tension point where we're sort of going to see what happens, because in the last few years, we've seen groups in support of Israel targeting various aspects of Iranian daily life. There was one attack that targeted the fuel stations of nationwide for citizens to receive subsidized oil. And this was a major disruption to citizens across the country for several days. There was also an attempted attack rather by Iranian hackers to change the water levels in Israeli water treatment facilities. And while that attack failed, these are sort of the precedents that we already have for activity between the two countries. And so I think going into the future, I think for the last few months, Iran's maybe been a little more internally focused as a result of the Masa Amini protests and other domestic concerns. But I think going forward, this may be an area where we really want to pay close attention to how these events unfold. And we can probably wrap up here. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining Charlie and I today. And if you're interested in learning more about RANE analyst coverage, go to ranenetwork.com, where you can see a wide array of analyses posted by our various analysts. And thank you so much for joining, and we'll be back next week.
Thank you, everybody.